Complacency and willingness to seek jobs elsewhere existed due to a number of factors, and long before Caribbean indentureship. On the one hand, the British capitalist class felt that India could satisfy the labor needs of other British interests, and on the other, because of severe economic hardships created by British imperial policies that rendered many peasants landless and subservient.
Many peasants who owned land became landless, or they became just labor, agricultural labor. In other words, their whole economy shattered, whatever it was, and they just became paupers.
A few years before they arrived in the West Indies, Indian immigrants had sailed to Mauritius in search of employment. Therefore, volunteering for another crossing was simply searching for new forms of survival and a better life, hopefully one superior to impoverishment and despair. They were also evading the rigors of devastating droughts, of severe flooding and hunger caused sometimes by man-made famine. The human cargo consisted Indian freedom fighters that were escaping the vengeance of British authorities, who rained terror on those involved in the Indian Revolt of 1857, the first major rebellion against British rule in India.
Now, once the revolt was suppressed, British followed twofold policy in the rural areas of Bhojpuri region, which is called Eastern Uttar Pradesh, or in Bihar. Now, one important aspect of the policy was not to recruit the Indians or the peasants of that region in army, and second was giving them exemplary punishment, hanging them on the trees. Now, this kind of policy explained 2 points. One is that those who revolted have been punished, and it was also a lesson for those who did not participate, which means that British would not only rule peacefully, but if needed they could apply force. Under the conditions, those who found that they would not be able to live comfortably here decided for an alternative.
Among the immigrants were persons who made the trip simply out of a sense of adventure. A few ran away from brushes with the law and bitter family disputes. Many pregnant wives used indentureship as a form of rescue from unworthy husbands whom they were forced to marry because their parents benefited from the dowry system. And then there were the sad stories of kidnapping.
There are a number of instances of a young girl, for example, going to fetch water, and these thugs, these thieves, these gundas would be around, and they'd capture her and take her away screaming to the coolie depot, where she would be threatened that if you made any trouble, if you made any difficulty, you would be killed. And so she had to agree to their conditions and then was brought to Calcutta. They're all of these kinds of tricks and devices that we use to inveigle people out of the life that they had and force them into indentureship.
Like Partabia Golia, who at aged 20 was snatched from her in-laws' home and kept isolated at the coolie depot before boarding her ship to Trinidad. She recalled having seen several of her villagers in a similar predicament, weeping helplessly as the ship left port. Unable to withstand the emotional separation, many of them committed suicide by throwing themselves overboard. But perhaps the most attractive inducement to come to Trinidad were the promises of grandeur and wealth peddled by deceitful Arcatias, whose primary objective was to secure huge financial rewards for bringing to the coolie depot at Garden Reach in Calcutta large contingents of immigrants, irrespective of age, caste, gender, religion, or willingness. Long before they arrived in Trinidad, those stories of milk and honey dished out by the Arcatias would spill and drown in the oceans. Firstly, the immigrants would be detained at the points of departure for very long periods. Life in the coolie depots was harsh and shocking, particularly to the Hindus, who were grouped together regardless of their caste differences. Conditions were filthy, with the constant prospect of an outbreak of contagious diseases. On board the ships, it was no different, and along the way, the immigrants would die 1,000 deaths over the Pagal Samundar, or crazy seas.
The most difficult part of that very difficult crossing from India to the Americas was in a region which the Indians call the Pagal Samundar. That is the Mad Sea. That's the translation of the word. And the Pagal Samundar is the area just south of the Cape of Good Hope, where there is a meeting between the cold waters of the Antarctic and the warm waters of the Atlantic on the one side, or the Indian Ocean. So it's a meeting of cold and hot. It's a meeting of very powerful currents that are coming from the south up north, and very powerful counter currents that are going from the north down south. So it's a very turbulent, an extremely turbulent area. And sometimes the ship would take a week, sometimes 8 to 9 days, just to make the crossing south of the Cape of Good Hope. And during that time, most of the Indians would have to be down beneath. Most of them would be moaning and crying and you know, feeling that this is the end of the world. And quite often the ship was badly damaged and had to put in at the Cape of Good Hope for repairs and so on. But the Cape of Good Hope was not normally a stopping point except for times of such disturbance.
Along the journey, fatal diseases aboard the ships would deprive mothers and fathers of their offsprings, and young children would lose parents. Disposal of the dead would be painfully unceremonious.
Quite often there were epidemics of cholera and dysentery and all kinds of diseases. And these ill persons were isolated, and once they died, they were put in a bag and holy stoned, it is called. That is an enormous brick was tied to the bag, and they were just thrown into the sea.
With bitter memories of a most horrifying journey still fresh in their minds, they would reach Port of Spain after 90 days, fatigued and almost lifeless, but thankful that they'd arrived alive. The Jahajis would disembark the Fath al-Razak and immediately perform Dandawat, a sacred act of touching Dharti Mata or Mother Earth after the long and life-threatening crossing. The sick and feeble would be taken to the colonial hospital in Port of Spain, whilst the others would walk to the coolie depot not far from where the ships would berth.
Those who were well enough would be taken by these horse carriages to their estates in various parts of Trinidad. A large number of them to what was called Coolie Town, which is now St. James. A large number of them to what is now, well, to the Diego Martin Estates, which is now in the Diamond Vale area. A number of them to estates all along what is now the east-west corridor, to Tacarigua and to Dinsley, and to Malabar Estate in Arima, and to San Juan Estate and El Socorro Estate, all of these estates on the east-west corridor, as well as to many estates down in the south. So they'd be taken there and, of course, allocated according to the number that the planter had been previously given.
Before leaving the coolie depot, someone would plant peepal trees as a mark of investiture to indicate an early presence in Port of Spain, as they prepared to anchor on the estates and plantations to begin a new life. Those who made the trip would also discover in themselves a stamina they perhaps never knew existed. On the estates, they'd be placed like their African brothers and sisters in cramped barrack houses, bare of furnishings with no privacy nor amenities.